Daoud, you are the Amir of the Association of British Muslims. Recently, Spinwatch has published a report, The Cold War on British Muslims. You've read that, I understand. Do you feel it's a fair assessment?
I think so, yes. I think there are obviously areas that they haven't touched upon. But that may be because too much information will actually weaken the impact of the report. And it probably the stuff I'm thinking of would really be simply over-egging the pudding or over-icing the cake, really. It would add more illustrations, but not necessarily change the direction of their report. So I think, yes, it's a reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, the report suggests that Islamophobia is not primarily intrinsic to British society, but it's something that is being prompted or instigated by specific organisations that have another agenda. Is that your assessment?
Unfortunately, yes. I think so. There has been a certain degree of this sort of unfocused reaction to Islam and Muslims. I think it's probably more had to do with the type of people who are Muslims. Somebody who has had an issue with his, say, Pakistani landlord may well have a negative attitude to Muslims, unspecified. Yet the same person was quite happily buying milk from his corner shop, who's also a Muslim, or buying kebabs off a kebab van in Edinburgh, who also is a Muslim. It's not particularly clear, that sort of level, and it's been around for some time. But the specific business that the Spinwatch report focuses on, I think, is a constructive matter.
Do you see Islamophobia as pervasive, or...?
Not really. Living in London, we're living not merely in a microclimate of its own, but a sort of social microclimate. And it's very easy to feel that the whole world behaves in exactly the same way. But you only need to travel, a few miles outside London and start talking to people in villages in Oxfordshire or Suffolk and so on, and you get a completely different picture of British people's attitude to Islam and Muslims. In some cases, certainly there's no hostility at all. In some cases, it's second or third hand that have picked up from reading a particular tabloid newspaper that morning, but it doesn't necessarily have any local context. I think there was an illustration of this when that lady breezed into Jack Straw's constituency surgery wearing her niqab, and it produced all that sort of business, a comment from Jack Straw and stuff in the newspaper. Somebody took a camera, a sort of high-aid thing, down to the taxi driver class, as it were, in East London. I don't know what they were hoping for, but they clearly didn't get an Islamophobic response, because the typical reaction was, it's nothing to do with me, it's a free country, they can wear what they like. And I think that, in a way, summarizes the general British attitude in the wider communities at large.
What do you feel then the agenda is of those who either are exacerbating tensions with Muslims or who are causing Islamophobia? What do you feel the agenda is? Or the cause, or the roots?
It's very difficult, I think, to put one's finger on an actual basic, fundamental reason for it. It certainly has benefits for people. Seeing that, according to the Spinwatch report, that there are two particular think tanks that seem to be feeding into it, whether this is conscious or simply a spin-off from what they're actually doing, is something I'm not really yet willing to, or competent to say. Yeah. But it certainly seems to be in effect. And the people funding it, I'm not sure what they're up to either. But but given the sort of people that they cite as their gurus, as it were, there's a worrying aspect to it, in that it is a certain American-style neoconservatism that is behind, or partly behind this. And this is something which I think in political terms needs to be looked at more closely, because I don't see that American neoconservatism, whatever its provenance, and whatever its chief guru Leo Strauss had to say, has absolutely zero relevance to British political culture. So that's something else. But I find that it is a disturbing trend if people are promoting Islamophobia as a means to achieve a political end, because this is something that I don't know whether people remember the Islamophobia report that was done by the Runnymede Foundation, but there was a key thing in it, I think, was Professor Cornwell suggested what he called the substitution test. That when you come across something in the press about Muslims and Islam, if you substitute Jews and Jewishness, or Jewry, or whatever the appropriate word would be, if you're not shocked by what it then tells you, then there's something wrong with you, basically. And I think if one applies Cornwell's substitution test to Islamophobia, people ought to be horrified at what they're doing, because echoes of 1930s Germany really ought to be sounding bells in their heads.
What do you feel Muslims could or should do in response to Islamophobia?
Well, certainly not react in a sort of physical or violent sense. This point too was made by a similar report that has just come out in the United States by the Center for American Progress. And they said there the people from the Council on American Islamic Relations say precisely that. Do not react in a physical or that sort of sense. But they do need to engage with people, and people who themselves are willing to listen. Part of the problem is that there is a certain sort of militant ignorance about that people do not want to know about anything to do with Islam, and are not willing to learn, yet are willing to react in an Islamophobic way. But there are people who will engage. Nobody's trying to convert anybody, but they're just trying to get people to understand how Muslims feel about things.
What about the Christian community? Do you feel Christians or the church leaders could do more in the face of Islamophobia?
I think so. I think the Church of England particularly has somehow got trapped in its rather cosy relationship with the House of Lords. Establishment has given it a sort of little bubble to live in, but establishment isn't by any means fireproof. There have been many people over recent years that have been sniping away at the established church. Muslims, by and large, are actually supportive of establishment, but this has given them a sort of a rather cosy way of looking out through a window at something that's going on outside. But I think they really need to get hold of the idea that in this sort of era of almost militant secularism, all faith communities are at risk. And in fact, Jonathan Sachs, the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations, made this very point in his Reith lecture back in 1996. So it's the case of whoever it was that said it at the time of the American Revolution. We must hang together, or by God, gentlemen, we shall hang separately. And I think all faith communities really must get the grip of this, because Islam or the Muslims may be the target now. It doesn't mean to say it's going to stop there.
No. And finally, what about the state or the authorities? What do you see as their responsibility at the moment?
I think really it sort of boils down initially to them watching what they say, because in this climate, however it has been generated, it's very easy for politicians who have a certain respect and a certain audience in the community. If they make an incautious remark that can be seen as reinforcing an Islamophobic thing, then it will reinforce it. And so they need to be very careful what they say, and particularly the media TV needs to watch it more because it has such similar sort of impact. But even the print media need to be very careful how they phrase things. I mean, there was this gang in the Midlands who were taking underage local girls and turning them to prostitution and so on. And they were branded as Muslim gang. No matter what the Sharia would say about that sort of thing. But by the same token, you could have said about the rioters in Tottenham and whatnot, they were Christian rioters. It would have an equal relevance to the way they were behaving. But that didn't happen, fortunately. But it makes it, to me, the Christian thinks in those terms. What if they called so-and-so a Christian rapist or a Christian mass murderer? This is very much like Professor Cornwall's substitution test. Again, people need to think in these terms.
The Spinwatch report suggests that some of the agencies that seem to be stoking or promoting fear of Islamophobia, their agenda is to influence government policy or to influence political opinion on Islam. Do you have any assessment of that?
I think, well, given the nature or the type of other programs that those particular think tanks and things get involved in, I would think that that's a fair statement. Because it would be difficult to see why they should be doing this otherwise. But quite why they would want to influence government policy or official policies towards Islam and Muslims in that sort of way is a bit of a mystery. It may be that they're doing the rather naughty thing of conflating Islam, the religion, with the sort of religious Volksreligiosität of migrant peoples from, say, North Africa or wherever they come from, and how they express it. This is seen, I think, by the way they tend to conflate Islam on the one hand with the nilotic practice of female genital mutilation, which has nothing to do with Islam, and similar things, forced marriage, honor killings, and so on. Again, which have nothing to do with Islam, but are practiced by Muslims, certain Muslims. They need to be a little bit more, if they're academic, they need to be a little bit more academic and rigorous about how they approach the subject.
Do you see Islamophobia growing or declining, or do you see a day when the term will be redundant, or is it something you've really got to live with?
I think in the British context, it is fairly much sort of urban, having an urban effect. It's not really that effective in the wider community out in the country. It's therefore, unfortunately, having its impact on people who, for one reason or another, feel aggrieved by immigration, and there's yet another stick to beat the immigrants with. In that context, I would see that it would take some time to dissipate. Even if people stop stoking it immediately, it will take a while to go away. The Muslims themselves have to approach it too in a honest manner. I think that some of their behaviors do in fact tend to stoke it as well. So they need to take a certain reappraisal of themselves. Too many assumptions go on along the lines of, well, Muslims are not racist. Well, yes, strictly speaking, they're not supposed to be. However, there are Muslim communities who are distinctly very, very racist. They really need to look at themselves in the mirror. And that affects people's responses to them, because if people are seen, people pick up languages, words from languages, and if they hear these buzzwords, then they know they're being talked about in a bad way. So they really need to be careful.
So, what do you see the role of the Association of British Muslims today in the context of Islamophobia?
We have to act, I think, as the sort of neutral, not exactly neutral, but no, I don't mean neutral. I mean the people in the middle, advocates of the middle way, but not I think, to be seen, because that's not our way we see ourselves, to be seen as sort of cozying up to government or so on. I think we need to be critical, but we need to promote solutions. Unfortunately, I think governments have proved themselves so far to be rather resistant to ideas that have come from us. Nevertheless, we need to be there. We need to advocate a moderate stance on things, both from the Muslim community and from the non-Muslim community towards each other. There is a moderate, typical British middle way that needs to be adopted.
Daoud, thank you very much. Thank you.